There's a place in the mind that I keep finding myself drawn back to. Not the thinking mind, the one that processes and plans then narrates the day. The other one, the one underneath, the subconscious. I've spent a lot of time fascinated by consciousness, the sheer strangeness of the fact that we can perceive things at all, that there is something it is like to be here, to look out through these particular eyes, to feel the weight of this particular moment. Consciousness is extraordinary. But the more I sit with it, the more I find my attention being pulled downward toward what it's floating on top of. The subconscious is the iceberg beneath the tip, and I mean that with some precision. The visible portion, the thoughts we're aware of having, the feelings we can name, the intentions we believe are driving our choices, represents a fraction of what's actually operational. Beneath it, something vast, dark, largely inaccessible, and quietly running most of the show. What I find myself doing more and more is trying to listen to it rather than simply be subject to it. Not through any formal practice necessarily, just through a quality of attention paid to the subtle signals it sends, the fragments of dreams that survive into waking. Most of it dissolves within minutes of opening your eyes, but occasionally something stays, an image, a feeling, an emotional residue that doesn't quite belong to the day that's beginning. I've learned to treat those fragments with more respect than I used to. They're not random. Something shows to surface. Something wanted to be noticed, even briefly, even incompletely. Then there's the imagery that arises when I close my eyes and let the mind run without agenda. Not directed thinking, not imagination exactly, more like a transmission from below. Shapes and scenes and emotional tones that arrive without being summoned, that seem to have their own logic, their own direction, their own relationship to what's being processed in the deeper layers. And the undertones, the emotions that are almost too subtle to catch, hovering at the edge of what you can feel, somewhere between sensation and nothing. The thing you noticed for half a second before the day's noise covered it again. I've become convinced these are some of the most important signals the mind produces. They're the subconscious speaking quietly before the volume of ordinary life drowns it out. The reason I keep returning to all of this is the question underneath it. If I could access it directly, that vault, would I want to? I've actually sat with that question for a long time, and I think my honest answer is yes, but carefully. Because what the subconscious holds isn't just the beautiful and the mysterious. It holds the unresolved, the things we've processed incompletely, the emotions we've stored without examining, the voids we've been filling on the surface without ever addressing what created them in the first place. That's not comfortable territory, but it's honest territory. What I ask myself when I close my eyes and go looking, what is it trying to tell me? Where does it want to lead me? What is sitting down there, waiting for enough light to finally move? These aren't questions with clean answers, but the act of asking them genuinely and repeatedly seems to produce something, a slightly more coherent relationship between the surface self and whatever's running below it, a gradual sense that the two are in conversation, rather than operating in complete separation. The subconscious is the place that connects the dream world to reality, the bridge between what we consciously intend and what we unconsciously enact. And learning to listen to it, even imperfectly, even partially, feels like one of the most important acts of self-knowledge available. So I'm curious, when you go quiet enough to hear the subtler signals beneath your conscious thoughts, what tends to surface? And do you trust what comes up, or do you find yourself quickly covering it over with the noise of the day? Most mornings, it's already gone. You wake up with the sense that something happened, something vivid, something with weight. And by the time you've reached for your phone or made the coffee, the whole thing has dissolved. A feeling remains, sometimes an image, and then even those fade, and the day begins as if nothing occurred. I've started to think that something important is being lost in that dissolution. Dreams are strange. There's no consensus on exactly what they are. Neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers have been arguing about it for as long as the disciplines have existed, and the honest answer is that we still don't fully know. But a few things are becoming clearer. During sleep, the brain isn't resting, it's consolidating, sorting the day's inputs of processing emotional material, making connections across disparate experiences in ways the focused waking mind is too narrow to achieve. And dreams seem to be the surface expression of that process, the story the consolidating brain tells itself while the work is underway. Which means dreams aren't random noise, they are a language, compressed, symbolic, oblique, but a language. And like any language you haven't studied, it sounds like chaos until you start paying attention. What I've noticed in my own dream life, when I've been attentive enough to catch it before it disappears, is that the imagery is rarely literal. The subconscious doesn't send memos, it sends metaphors. A house you've never been in that somehow feels like yours. A person you know standing in a context that makes no logical sense, doing something that carries enormous emotional weight. A recurring location that appears across years of dreams, always slightly different, always charged with the same feeling. These aren't accidents. The subconscious is a symbolist. It speaks in the language of image and feeling rather than proposition and argument. And if you want to understand what it's trying to say, you have to learn to read the images rather than waiting for a clear declarative statement that will never come. There's a practice I've developed that's simple but requires consistency. The moment I wake, before anything else, I lie still and let whatever is present come forward. No immediate movement, no reaching for a device, nothing that activates the organizing, analytical mind before the dream material has had a chance to surface. Then I hold whatever is there, an image, a feeling, a fragment of narrative, and I ask not what it means logically, but what it feels like, what emotional truth it's carrying, what part of my current life it might be in conversation with. The answers aren't always immediate. Sometimes a dream image sits with me for days before something clicks, but I've found that the clicks, when they come, tend to illuminate something that was happening below the level of my conscious awareness, something I was working through without knowing I was working through it, an anxiety about a relationship that I hadn't admitted was there, a grief that hadn't finished its process, a desire that I'd been quietly not acknowledging. What happens when you start paying serious attention to dreams is that the surface self and the deeper self begins to shift. The subconscious starts to feel less like a locked vault and more like a correspondent, something that is actively trying to communicate, that has been trying to communicate all along, and that responds to being listened to by communicating more clearly. The language gets easier to read the more you practice reading it. The images start to carry context. The patterns become recognizable. And occasionally, not always, but occasionally, you wake up from a dream knowing something you didn't know when you went to sleep. Something true. Something the waking mind had been too busy or too defended to let in. So I'm curious, when you think about the dreams you remember most vividly from your life, the ones that stayed with you, the ones that left a feeling you couldn't quite shake, what do you think they might have been trying to say? And did you ever give them enough quiet to find out? I've had the same dream more than once. Most people have. A location that keeps returning. A house, a school, a road that goes somewhere you can never quite reach. A scenario that replays with variations, the details shifting slightly each time, but the emotional core remaining consistent. A feeling that arrives in the dream that you recognize immediately because you've felt it there before. The recurring dream is one of the stranger phenomena the mind produces. Strange because it implies intention, because random wouldn't return to the same place, the same image, the same unresolved feeling. Something is being revisited, something the deeper mind hasn't finished with yet. The prevailing understanding, and I find this genuinely compelling, is that recurring dreams are the subconscious working on something it hasn't yet resolved. a persistent emotional situation, a fear that hasn't been examined directly, an experience that wasn't fully processed when it occurred and is being returned to again and again because the work isn't done. The dream is the processing. The repetition is the sign that the processing isn't complete. What I find interesting is how consistent the emotional signature tends to be across different versions of the same recurring dream. The setting might change, the specific events might vary, but the feeling, the particular quality of anxiety or loss or pursuit or being unable to do something you desperately need to do, that stays constant. Because it's the feeling that's the subject. The story wrapped around it is just the delivery mechanism. I've had dreams in which I'm in a place I can never quite leave. The exits keep changing, the rooms multiply, something keeps me circling without reaching the door. And when I've sat with the feeling that dream carries, genuinely sat with it away from the dream itself, what I find is a very specific anxiety about situations in waking life where I felt trapped by circumstances or obligations I couldn't see my way out of. The dream wasn't about architecture, it was about that feeling, and it kept returning while the feeling was still unresolved. Which brings me to the part of this that I find most significant. What happens when a recurring dream stops? In my experience, it doesn't usually end abruptly. It fades. The returns become less frequent, the emotional intensity less acute until at some point you realize it hasn't visited in months. And that absence tends to correspond to something shifting in the waking world, a situation resolving, a fear being faced, an emotional pattern being understood at a level deep enough that the subconscious no longer needs to keep flagging it. The dream was the messenger. When the message was received, the messenger stopped coming. This has changed how I relate to recurring dreams when they appear. Rather than experiencing them as unwanted intrusions, as the mind being stuck, as something going wrong in the sleep, I've started treating them as invitations, an invitation to look at what they're carrying, to sit with the emotional core rather than analyzing the imagery, to ask, what is this feeling in my waking life, and what am I not looking at directly that this dream keeps returning to show me? The subconscious is not subtle about the things it really needs you to address. It will repeat itself with a patience that is, in retrospect, almost touching. Night after night, variation after variation, the same essential message arriving in different wrapping until something finally hears it. And when it's heard, really heard, acted on, metabolized, the dream releases. It has no more reason to return. The correspondence is complete. So here's what I'm sitting with. If you have a recurring dream or a recurring feeling in dreams that has followed you across years of your life, what do you think it's been trying to show you? And is there something in your waking life that you've been circling without looking at directly?
There's a figure that appears in dreams. You know the one. The pursuer, the threatening stranger, the dark shape at the edge of the room that you can't quite look at directly. The person whose face you can't see, but whose presence carries enormous weight, dread, fascination, something uncomfortably close to both at once. Most people wake from these dreams unsettled and move on, chalking it up to stress or a late meal or the random noise of a sleeping brain. But I've come to think these figures deserve more than that. Because in the Jungian framework, which I've found more genuinely useful than almost any other lens for understanding the deeper material of dreams, these threatening figures are rarely about external threat at all. They're about the self. Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything we've refused to identify with, everything we've disowned, everything we've been told or told ourselves doesn't belong to who we are, the impulses we've suppressed, the qualities we've judged in others because we couldn't acknowledge them in ourselves, the capacities we've buried, sometimes genuinely destructive ones, sometimes simply ones that didn't fit the self-concept we needed to maintain. The shadow isn't evil. It's just everything that didn't make the cut for the conscious identity. And what gets placed there tends to be whatever the particular person, in the particular culture, with the particular history they carry, found unacceptable enough to store rather than integrate. In dreams, the shadow tends to appear as a figure, usually same gender, or at least not clearly other, usually threatening or pursuing, or simply present in a way that generates that specific charged feeling, the feeling of something that knows you and that you're trying to not know. What the dream is doing when it sends this figure is offering an encounter, not because the subconscious wants to frighten you, because integration is what it's working toward. The material in the shadow doesn't want to stay there. It wants to be recognized, examined, and returned to the whole self in some usable form. The dream is one of the primary mechanisms through which that process gets initiated. What I've found personally, and what the Jungian tradition describes extensively, is that the threatening figure in the dream becomes less threatening the more directly you engage with it, rather than fleeing, in the dream and in waking reflection about the dream. When you turn toward the pursuer and ask what they want, the quality of the encounter often shifts entirely. The monster that was chasing you stops. The stranger reveals a face you recognize. The dark figure at the edge of the room steps into the light and becomes, in some way, comprehensible. What they're usually carrying when you look is something you need. Energy you've been suppressing. Assertiveness that got filed under aggression and locked away. Ambition you decided was unseemly. Wildness you decided was irresponsible. Grief you decided was weakness. The shadow holds what got labeled unacceptable, and what got labeled unacceptable is often exactly what a fuller version of you requires. This is the paradox at the center of shadow work. The figure you've been running from in the dream is carrying something that belongs to you, something that has been yours all along. The fear was never about what they might do. It was about what you might have to acknowledge if you stopped running long enough to look. I don't think this work is ever finished. The shadow isn't a problem you solve once and leave behind. It's more like a relationship that requires ongoing tending. A relationship with the parts of yourself that didn't get included in the first draft of who you decided to be. So I'm curious, when you think about the figures that have pursued or threatened or unsettled you in dreams across your life, and you sit with them honestly rather than dismissing them, what quality or capacity do you think they might have been carrying back to you?
There's a feeling I've been trying to describe for years. It's not quite an emotion in the conventional sense, not sadness, not anxiety, not joy. It's something quieter than any of those. Something that exists at the edge of what you can perceive, barely above the threshold of noticeability, hovering in the background of whatever else is happening. I've started calling it the undertone. You probably know it. It's the thing you almost didn't notice this morning, a faint sense of something unresolved sitting just beneath the surface of your day, or the low, persistent warmth that was present all week before you identified it as anticipation, or the subtle unease that shadowed a particular conversation long before anything was said that explained it. These signals are easy to miss. They're designed to be, in a way, or at least the mind doesn't amplify them the way it amplifies urgent threats or strong pleasures. They exist at low volume. And in a world that runs at high volume almost continuously, low volume tends to get drowned out. But here's what I've come to believe about undertones. They're often more accurate than the louder, more dramatic feelings. The big emotions are real, but they're also reactive. They're triggered by events, by stimuli, by the situation immediately in front of you. They can be manipulated by a bad night's sleep, by low blood sugar, by the residue of an unrelated frustration bleeding into a context where it doesn't belong. The undertone comes from somewhere different. It seems to arise from the deeper processing layers, from the subconscious material we explored in the last segment, from whatever the mind has been quietly working through below the level of daily awareness. It's less reactive and more considered in a strange way, less about what just happened and more about what's actually true. I've learned to pay particular attention to undertones that persist, A single day's faint unease might be nothing, the residue of a dream, a passing mood, the body doing something neurochemical that has no particular significance. But an undertone that's there on Tuesday and still there on Thursday, still present in slightly different form on Saturday, that's something worth sitting with. That kind of persistence tends to mean that something real is being signaled, something the louder parts of the mind haven't gotten around to processing yet. What I find most interesting is where undertones tend to point. In my experience, they cluster around a few things. Relationships that are slightly off in a way I haven't consciously acknowledged. Creative or professional directions that aren't quite aligned with something deeper. A quiet friction between what I'm doing and what I'm actually oriented toward. Unresolved emotional material that hasn't finished its processing. Things I'm avoiding looking at directly that the subconscious is gently, persistently flagging from below. The undertone is the subconscious being patient. It's not sounding an alarm. It tried that and learned that alarms get rationalized away. So instead it hums, quietly, consistently, waiting for you to be still enough to notice that it's been there all along. Developing a relationship with undertones requires a specific kind of quiet. The body needs to be still, and the mind needs to be relatively undistracted, which is why so many of them surface in the transitional moments of the day. The first minutes of the morning before the agenda assembles itself. The walk where you're not listening to anything. The shower, the drive on familiar roads, the moment before sleep claims the day. These are the windows where the volume of ordinary life drops enough that the quieter signal can be heard. I've started treating those windows as appointments, not to fill them with content or productivity, but to show up to them empty enough that whatever is present can surface. And what surfaces, more often than not, has something worth knowing in it. So here's what I'm sitting with. If you went quiet right now, genuinely quiet, and listened for the undertone beneath whatever the obvious feelings are, what do you think you might find there? And how long has it been trying to get your attention?
There's a version of the past that never quite becomes the past. It sits somewhere below the threshold of daily awareness, not forgotten exactly, not present exactly, in a kind of suspended state, waiting. For what, it's not always clear, but waiting. I've been thinking about what the subconscious actually stores when something happens that we don't fully process. Because the assumption most of us carry, that time heals, that things fade, that the past eventually becomes inert, turns out to be only partially true. Time does something, but it doesn't finish the work that processing would have finished. What it does instead is bury, and buried things don't decompose cleanly. They preserve. The experience I'm describing is probably familiar in some form. A situation from years ago that still produces a disproportionate reaction when it surfaces, a spike of feeling that seems too large for the distance between then and now, a pattern of behavior that keeps appearing in different contexts with different people, in circumstances that seem unrelated and yet always arrives at the same emotional destination. An avoidance that has been in place so long you've stopped noticing it's an avoidance. It just feels like preference, like personality, like the way you are. These are the signatures of the unresolved, the subconscious doing its best to manage something it was never able to metabolize. Metabolism is the right word, I think. Emotions are meant to move. They arise, they peak, they inform, they release. That's the complete arc. But when the release doesn't happen, when the feeling is cut off mid-process, pushed down before it can complete, stored rather than experienced, it doesn't disappear. It sits in the system. And the system works around it, the way a river works around a boulder, finding new routes, exerting extra energy, shaping everything downstream around the obstruction that was never removed. Managing the unresolved is what most of us do most of the time. And management is not nothing. It keeps things functional. It prevents the blocked material from flooding everything at once. It allows life to continue. But there's a cost to sustained management that accumulates quietly. The energy required to keep something down is energy unavailable for everything else.
The patterns generated by the unresolved material keep running, keep producing the same relational dynamics, the same emotional responses, the same limitations, because the source code hasn't been addressed. Only the symptoms have been managed. What it actually takes to address rather than manage is something I've had to learn slowly and imperfectly. It begins with willingness, specifically the willingness to move toward the thing rather than continuing to root around it. That sounds straightforward. It rarely is, because the roots around it are usually comfortable, familiar, often don't feel like avoidance at all. They feel like normal life. What helps is what we've been building toward across these segments. The dream that keeps returning, that's the unresolved flagging itself from below. The undertone that persists through the week, that's often the felt sense of something stored that wants to move. The disproportionate reaction, that's the past speaking through the present, using the current situation as a vehicle for something that has been waiting for permission to finally surface. Addressing it means letting it surface, fully, rather than just enough to manage, with enough stillness and enough honesty that the feeling can complete the arc it was interrupted from completing the first time. This is where the real work is, quieter than most inner work gets credit for, less dramatic than breakthrough narratives suggest, more like the gradual, unglamorous process of allowing something to tawn and then watching what it becomes when it does. The unresolved doesn't have to stay that way, but it does require something more than time. It requires turning toward it, directly, honestly, without immediately reaching for the management strategy, which takes a kind of courage we've talked about before, the courage to feel what's actually there. So here's what I find myself wondering. When you think about the emotional material in your own life that has never quite finished moving, the things you've learned to work around rather than through, what do you think it would take to finally let them complete their arc? The mind doesn't always think in words. This is something I've had to learn to accept because I spend so much of my conscious life in language, constructing sentences, analyzing arguments, reaching for the precise term that captures what I mean. Language feels like thinking. It often is, but it's not the only kind, and for certain kinds of material, it might not even be the primary kind. The deeper the subject, the more the mind seems to reach for image rather than proposition, for metaphor rather than definition, for the story that carries the meaning rather than the statement that declares it. Jung called this symbolic thinking, the mind's capacity to process the things that resist direct articulation by encoding them in image and narrative instead. And the more I've paid attention to my own interior life, the more I've found this to be not a limitation, but a precision. Symbols aren't imprecise containers for things that could be said more clearly in plain language. They're the appropriate medium for certain kinds of truth. Truths that are too layered, too paradoxical, too emotionally complex to survive translation into a declarative sentence without losing most of what they actually are. Take the symbol of water. Across virtually every human culture and every period of recorded history, water appears in myths and dreams and art as something that carries consistent meaning. Change, the unconscious, emotion, birth, death, the thing that shapes without being shaped, the thing that finds its own level. No one decided this collectively. It seems to arise independently repeatedly because water actually embeds these qualities physically. The symbol isn't arbitrary, it's accurate. The mind uses it because it fits. What I find remarkable is how personal the symbolic vocabulary can be alongside the universal one. Beyond the symbols that appear to be wired into human beings at some deep level, each person develops their own symbolic lexicon. Images and metaphors that carry specific private meaning rooted in their particular history and inner life. A specific house, a recurring animal, a color that always arrives in certain emotional states, a landscape that returns in dreams and reverie and carries every time the same unmistakable feeling. These private symbols are the subconscious communicating in a language it is built specifically for you. And they reward study the way any language rewards study, The more fluent you become, the more you can receive. What symbolic thinking reveals about the nature of inner life, I think, is something important about how depth works. The deepest material, the experiences that have shaped us most fundamentally, the fears and desires that operate most powerfully below the surface, tends to be pre-linguistic. It was felt before it was named. It was encoded in sensation and image before the verbal mind had the tools to approach it. And so when the subconscious wants to process it or communicate about it, it reaches back for the original medium: image, feeling, story. This is why the dream doesn't send a memo. This is why the recurring symbol in your life isn't a coincidence waiting to be explained away. This is why a piece of music can reach something in you that 1,000 articulate words about the same subject couldn't touch. The symbol bypasses the analytical layer and speaks directly to the part of you that the analytical layer was built on top of. I've started maintaining a loose personal inventory of the images that recur in my interior life, not to decode them with some external key — dream dictionaries tend to be too generic to be useful — but to notice what feeling each one accompanies, what context tends to produce it, what it seems to be adjacent to in my inner life. The goal is fluency, not translation. To understand the language well enough to have a conversation with it rather than staring at it as if it were hieroglyphs. Because once you develop that fluency, even partially, even imperfectly, the subconscious becomes less opaque. The vault from the first segment opens a little. And what comes through isn't chaos. It's something that has been trying to be understood for a very long time. So I'm curious. When you think about the images or symbols or metaphors that keep appearing in your own inner life, in dreams, in the things you're drawn to, in the language you reach for without knowing why, what do you think they might be carrying? And have you ever tried to learn their particular grammar?
There's a knowing that arrives before the reasoning does. You felt it. A decision that was made somewhere below conscious deliberation before you sat down to weigh the options. A sense about a person that was present from the first exchange, accurate in retrospect, impossible to fully justify at the time. A direction that felt right in the body before the mind had assembled a single argument for it. We call this intuition. And we tend to treat it with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. Reverent when it turns out to be right, suspicious when we can't explain the mechanism. What I've come to believe through everything we've been exploring in this series is that intuition is neither mystical nor unreliable by nature. It's the subconscious speaking in real time. And once you understand it that way, the relationship to it changes. Here's what seems to be happening beneath the experience. The subconscious is processing vastly more information than the conscious mind. We've talked about this, the millions of bits versus the handful that make it through to awareness. It's reading body language, tone, context, pattern, the gap between what's being said and what's being communicated. It's cross-referencing the current situation against everything similar you've ever encountered, running comparisons at a speed and scale the analytical mind can't approach. And when it reaches a conclusion, when the pattern recognition produces something definitive, it sends that conclusion upward. Not as an argument, not as a series of logical steps, as a feeling, as a physical sensation, as the thing you just know without quite knowing how you know it. That's the felt sense, the body delivering the subconscious's assessment through the only channel that bypasses the analytical layer entirely. The reason intuition gets a mystical reputation is that we can't trace the working. The conscious mind, which is accustomed to seeing its own reasoning, experiences the conclusion arriving without the visible process that generated it, and interprets that as something other than ordinary cognition. But it isn't. It's cognition that runs faster and deeper than what we can consciously observe. What makes intuition unreliable isn't the mechanism. The mechanism is sophisticated. What makes it unreliable is contamination. The felt sense can be distorted by fear that mimics warning, by wishful thinking that mimics confirmation, by the unresolved material we explored a few segments back. Old wounds generating false signals in the present tense.
This is why developing a reliable relationship with intuition requires something beyond just trusting whatever arises. It requires learning the difference between the clear signal and the noise. In my experience, the cleanest intuitive signals have a particular quality. They're quiet rather than loud. They don't insist or repeat. They simply remain, steady and consistent, available each time you return to check. They tend to feel like recognition rather than revelation, like something you already knew surfacing rather than arriving. The loud, insistent feelings, the ones that spike and demand immediate action, that feel urgent and slightly frantic, those tend to be the contaminated ones. The anxiety dressed as warning, the longing dressed as certainty. Learning to tell them apart is some of the most valuable inner work available, and it takes time and accumulated self-knowledge to do accurately. What I've found helps is exactly what we've been building across this whole series. The practice of listening downward creates more access to the quiet signal. The work on the unresolved material reduces the contaminating noise. The symbolic literacy allows you to read what the subconscious is communicating with more nuance. Each practice compounds the others, and at the center of it all, the intuitive signal becomes more legible, more trustworthy, more consistently accurate. Intuition isn't a gift some people have and others don't. It's a channel, and like all channels, its clarity depends on what's running through it and how much attention you've given to keeping it open. So, I'm curious, when you think about the intuitive signals in your own life, the quiet knowings you've honored and the ones you've overwritten, what do you notice about the times you trusted yourself accurately, and what was different about the times the signal got lost in the noise? Everything we've been exploring across these segments, the vault, the dream language, the undertone, the recurring image, the unresolved material, the symbolic vocabulary, all of it assumes one thing, that you can get quiet enough to hear any of it. That's the practice. And it's both simpler and harder than it sounds. The subconscious doesn't speak loudly. We've established that. It communicates in the register of whisper, of impression, of the feeling that hovers at the edge of what you can consciously grasp, which means the primary obstacle to hearing it is volume. The sustained, relentless volume of a life that is almost never genuinely quiet. Not just external noise, though that's part of it, but the internal noise that runs continuously even in silence. The planning, the reviewing, the constructing of narratives about the past and the future. The mind that is almost never in the present moment long enough for the deeper layer to surface through it. Listening downward is the practice of creating a different set of conditions. Conditions in which the ordinary noise drops enough that something quieter can be heard. Here's what I've found actually works, in practice, over time. The first is stillness before input. The transition from sleep to waking is the most reliable window I've found for subconscious material, not because anything mystical happens at dawn, but because the analytical mind hasn't fully assembled itself yet, and whatever the night was processing is still close to the surface. Lying still for a few minutes before the day begins, before any input arrives, before the agenda takes over, in that small window, things surface that disappear the moment you pick up a phone or start constructing the day's plan. The practice is simply to be in that window long enough to notice what's present. The second is movement without destination. Walking without a podcast, without a phone, without a purpose other than moving through space. There's something about the rhythm of walking, the bilateral movement, the mild physical engagement that doesn't consume cognitive resources, that seems to loosen material from below. Ideas arrive, feelings surface, images come forward that have been waiting for a gap in the schedule. The subconscious uses motion as a carrier. The third is the practice of the question held open. Rather than trying to think through a problem or feeling directly, which engages the analytical layer and keeps the deeper layer at bay, I've found it more effective to pose a question to myself and then release it. Not pursue it, release it. Let it sink downward rather than working it at the surface. And then notice where it arrives over the following hours or days, in the margins of other activities, in the half-aware moments before sleep, in dreams. The subconscious tends to answer questions that have been genuinely posed and then genuinely released. It works better without the pressure of the conscious mind standing over it, demanding immediate results. The fourth is creative output without agenda. Writing that has no destination. Drawing, even without skill. Any form of expression that bypasses the critic and the editor and creates a channel between the interior and the exterior without quality control. What comes through in those conditions is often surprising. Images, connections, emotional material that wouldn't survive the filter of intentional, purposeful creation. The subconscious uses the creative channel the way water uses a crack in stone. Wherever there's an opening, it moves through. What all of these have in common is the same thing, a reduction of the top layer activity that normally keeps the deeper layer from being heard. You're not forcing anything upward. You're creating the conditions in which it can move on its own. This is the direction of all inner work, I think, downward, toward what has been running beneath the noise this whole time, waiting with more patience than we've been giving it credit for. So here's what I'm sitting with. Of the conditions we've talked about, the morning stillness, the aimless walk, the question released, the unguarded creative expression, which one feels most available to you right now? And what do you think might surface if you gave it genuine space this week?